Hello people! Pokemon professors, while not typically as prominent in our journeys as rivals, gym leaders, and evil teams, have played a pivotal role in the overall Pokemon experience. They're among the first people the player encounters when setting off on their adventure, and they're often responsible for giving trainers their first Pokemon. As a matter of fact, the very first character we met in all of Pokemon all the way back in 1996 was none other than Professor Oak, and he served as the whole world's introduction to Pokemon. In this installment of the A Look At series, we're celebrating the Pokemon world's pillars of science and discovery by going over the Professor archetype. I'll be going over every professor in the main series games, but because there's typically only one main professor per region, I'll also be discussing the lesser known minor professors and scientists from the games. I'm even including a character who isn't technically even part of the main series. And as always, since we're talking about concept and design, I'll be taking into account all of the different looks that any given character's received over the years where applicable. Starting off with Kanto's Professor Oak, although he received a couple iterations over the years from the abundance of games that had the Kanto region in them, most of them simply show him in different art styles while keeping the actual design mostly the same. He's a middle-aged man with trousers, a polo shirt, and of course a lab coat. Funnily enough, he seems to be wearing slippers in his Gen 1 design. Although Oak's designs tend to stay the same aside from some minor color variation or added accessories, his official art from Gen 2 along with this Heart Gold and Soul Silver sprite have him sporting a yellow shorter jacket instead of the usual lab coat. I assume this is because he's on a temporary visit to Johto in those games and therefore wearing something more casual and suitable for travel. I really hope we'll see more of this design in the future because I honestly think he looks quite fashionable like this. He's almost got a bit of a silver fox thing going on, the old Kudo. Okay, I'll shut up. Weirdly enough, this design isn't fully reflected by either set of Johto games as he never actually wears the yellow jacket in-game in Gen 2 and he only wears it in the intro cutscene in Heart Gold and Soul Silver and not when you actually meet him. But let me backpedal a little bit. Oak's classic usual design, while simple, really doesn't require any major changes. I think it's incredibly appropriate that he stayed so consistent over the years. In a way, I think he represents the very foundation of Pokemon itself. He's always there waiting to start you off on your journey and give you your starter Pokemon regardless of time period. I love Pokemon's redesigns and remakes, but Oak is probably one that will never need much changing. With that being said, please give us a young Oak from the time he was a trainer in a future prequel game. Unlike future professors, Oak doesn't exactly have a specialty because he was the first one to do it and didn't need to distinguish himself from other professors. He's known for creating and tasking you with filling in the Pokédex, but his invention of it was sorta retconned in future games. We know from Legends Arceus that the concept of a Pokédex has existed for far longer, and even the idea of an electronic version might not have been entirely patented by Oak if we are to believe that the Hoenn games take place roughly simultaneously with the Kanto games. Although personally I believe Birch's Pokédex was created based on Oak's, even if both versions were distributed to trainers around the same time. Maybe Oak shared his blueprints with the scientific world. This man does not gatekeep. Aside from Blue and Daisy, a known relative of Professor Oak, full name Samuel Oak, is Professor Samson Oak from Alola. They're cousins, and aside from different skin tones and haircuts, the two have nigh identical features. If we were to take character resemblance at face value in Pokemon, which I don't, the human genetics of this world could be an entire video in of itself. Although not the main professor in Alola, Samson Oak specializes in studying regional forms, a concept introduced in his debut game Sun and Moon. Every Pokemon with an Alolan form was originally discovered in Kanto, so it makes sense that the professor in charge of studying them resembles the professor from Kanto. It's also a nice callback to the original game since Sun and Moon were released during and in celebration of Pokemon's 20th anniversary. Does that mean we could see a third Sam Oak in Gen 10 for the 30th anniversary? I imagine a Mediterranean Oak. Samson Oak's design is meant to evoke the tropical environment and theme of Alola, with a Hawaiian shirt, shorts, open-toe sandals, and sunglasses. And would you look at that, his nephew also has sunglasses in the same games. Wonder if it's intentional. Okay. There is another Oak lookalike in Pokemon, but this one is strange and shrouded in mystery and he doesn't come from a mainline game. This is who I was talking about in the intro. I'm talking about Grand Oak from Pokemon Home, and boy do I have a lot to say about him. Guys, I cannot stress this enough. Tangent incoming. I'm breaking my mainline only rule and including him in the video for two reasons. One, he is in some way related and intentionally evocative of a mainline character connecting him to the core games. And two, the game, or rather app that he is from, is a companion to the mainline games. It's a hub that connects all of them. Out of all the non-mainline software, an app like Home is the least separated from the main series games. As of now, it is unconfirmed if Grand Oak is in any way canon to the games. Other than his resemblance to Professor Professor Oak, there is nothing tying him to them. However, I have a couple of theories about him and they get pretty insane. Me and my friend joke about this character sometimes because he's rarely discussed and tucked in an optional app while also potentially having immense implications on the lore of Pokemon. But what does Grand Oak even do? Well, we know that he's a researcher who developed the Pokemon Home Service and that, just like Professor Oak, he wants your help to compile a Pokédex, although in his case a much more comprehensive one. The most grounded interpretation of the character is that he's a relative of Professor Oak whose chosen scientific field is Pokemon storage systems along with Pokemon archiving and documentation. We don't know what region he's from, but so far nothing about him impacts the canon in a major way. But let's examine what Pokemon Home does for a moment. Pokemon Home can transport Pokemon from various trainers in a variety of games. In the lore of Pokemon, it is commonly accepted that different versions or remakes of a game represent different timelines of the events in it. The same can even be extended to individual player save files. Different players pick different characters to play as or have different team members. All of it is canon except it's happening in parallel universes. Oftentimes when Pokemon are transferred from different games, there will be text, usually in their summaries, saying that they time traveled or that they came from across space and time. Now this can easily be hand-waved as simple flavor text that goes along with a useful gameplay feature that doesn't canonically have implications on the lore. In other words, you could say it's something the player can do for ease of gameplay but isn't necessarily also occurring in-universe. But if we choose to look at cross-game and intergenerational Pokemon transfers as canonically connecting different worlds like with the link cable device from ORAS, then that completely changes what Pokemon Home means to the Pokemon universe. This outlook turns Home into a cross-dimensional pocket space where Pokemon from different timelines and periods can be gathered and redistributed around the multiverse, and Grand Oak is its omnipotent, omnipresent admin and warden. This leads me to my two fringe crackpot theories about his character. Crackpot theory number 1, Grand Oak is God. His ability to connect all the different games and their timelines is an extension of his godly power. Think Arceus sending the player across spacetime to Hisui. In fact, Arceus mentions that the mythical Pokemon called Arceus is merely a part of the godly whole of the Pokemon world. Perhaps if Arceus is the Pokemon part of God, another component is the human part, manifested as Grand Oak. And the reason behind his resemblance to Professor Oak is because he's a trusted and reputable person in the world of Pokemon. We perceive God as looking similar to a figure we are comforted by. Think about it, Grand Oak loosely matches popular depictions of the Abrahamic god and even some pagan gods. Old dude, white beard. This is the more reasonable of my two theories. Crackpot theory number 2, Grand Oak is from the distant future and is either a descendant of Professor Oak or an immortal, superlatively aged Oak. Perhaps he's from a time where people's scientific knowledge and understanding of the universe advanced to a point of near transhumanism, a point where people can freely access different times and dimensions, potentially after finding a way to harvest and master the properties of Dialga and Palkia or even the Light Trios. Alternatively, maybe Grand Oak is so vastly knowledgeable and powerful that he can even peer through the veil of pixels and code and understand that him and the entire Pokemon multiverse is inside a mere video game. Knowing this, he can simply reach into various games to grab Pokemon. The rules of the world don't apply when you become aware that your world isn't even real. That's why Grand Oak addresses you directly in Pokemon Home. He isn't talking to a character you play as, but rather us, the very people holding the controller. Anyway, returning to the mainline professors, the next one I'd like to talk about is the second Pokemon professor to ever be introduced in the core games. Professor Elm from Johto is often slightly overlooked by the fans, I think. He's not as iconic as Oak and doesn't have as memorable of an introduction as Birch, and is the only professor in the first 7 generations to not be the one greeting you during his game's intro. Oak does it instead, and since he appears alongside Elm in the Johto games, he steals some of his thunder. Elm is characterized as somewhat ditzy and airheaded. He's a younger, more inexperienced professor, at least compared to his senior Oak. Low-key, he would get along with Bianca quite well. Professor Elm specializes in Pokemon eggs, a feature that was newly added in Gold and Silver when his character was first introduced. Other than that, I guess you could say Elm is notable for the fact that one of his starters was stolen by a rival Silver. Maybe that's supposed to play into his negligence. Elm made appearances in both Gens 2 and 4 in all Johto games, but on both occasions his design mostly stayed the same, minus the fact that they removed the horizontal stripe on his shirt in Heart Gold and Soul Silver. If you've seen other videos in this series, you might be used to the idea that many Pokemon characters end up receiving significant redesigns in future appearances, but as we've seen with both Oak and Elm, this isn't really the case with professors. None of the 4 professors whose games were remade received meaningful design changes aside from updated official art. Like I said, I think it's appropriate for Oak, but I wouldn't have minded if some of the others were tweaked a little bit. Generation 3 saw the introduction of Professor Birch in the Hoenn region. He reappeared in the Gen 6 Hoenn games, but like I said, his design remained unchanged. I like that Oak has this sort of average figure, Elm is lean and tall, and Birch is shorter and stocky. All 3 of them have have distinguishable silhouettes, which is character design 101. Birch's sandals and shorts are an easy way of conveying Hoenn's warmer subtropical climate. The shoulder bag he carries is appropriate seeing as he specializes in studying Pokemon habitats, which presumably involves working on the field more than your average professor. Now, the idea of habitats isn't directly related to any new features introduced in Ruby and Sapphire, which is when Birch first appeared, but it does make sense in the context of Hoenn's prevalent theme of nature and its environment. Birch is most remembered for his introduction scene where he is being chased by Poochyena or Zigzagoon in Emerald. He ended up dropping his bag containing Hoenn's starter Pokemon on the ground and asks the player to pick one of them out. Not because he chose to entrust the player with a rare Pokemon, but rather because he needs you to battle his wild attacker and rescue him. Of course, he lets you keep your starter and later gives you a Pokédex just like the previous professors, but the unusual circumstances of your encounter with him are quite amusing and a nice change of pace. Birch is also known for being friends with the player's father, Norman, and being himself the father of your rival, so either Brendan or May depending on who you didn't pick to play as. The frigid Sinnoh region is home to the stern Professor Rowan, one of my favorite Pokemon professors in the series. In terms of design, it is striking that he was the first and as of now the only main regional professor to never be shown wearing a lab coat in the games. Instead, he sports a dark trench coat that directly contrasts all of the other professors, seeing as their lab coats are the typical white. The rest of his attire is more formal than the previous three professors, with a nice button-up vest and tie. It gives him a certain air of prestige, which is fitting for one of the oldest professors in the series. Although arguably not as famous in-universe as Oak, he's actually been in the field for longer. Rowan is a bit like a reverse Elm, whereas the former is older and collected, the latter is young and a bit clumsy. Professor Rowan comes from a pretty important family, as he is ambiguously descended from or at least related to Commander Kamado, the leader of the Galaxy team who came to Sinnoh in the past and started an effort to study and modernize the region. If only colonization in the real world was as peaceful and respectful of indigenous cultures as in Pokemon. Rowan's specialty is Pokemon evolution, which, while once again not a new feature introduced in his debut games, is still fitting for Sinnoh because of all the new evolutions to older Pokemon that were introduced in Gen 4. The reason I like Rowan is because I'm a fan of the tough on the outside, sweet on the inside trope, and I think Rowan is especially kind. Similarly to Birch, the circumstances that lead to Rowan offering you a starter Pokemon are quite unique in both Diamond and Pearl and their Gen 8 remakes. When he forgets his briefcase with their Pokeballs at Lake Verity, the player and Barry attempt to return it but end up being forced to use the Pokemon inside to defend themselves against a group of wild Starly. You sort of end up stealing your starter, but unlike Silver and Johto, it's a lot less malicious and kind of unintentional. But of course he later allows you to keep it. Things play out differently in Platinum, where he deliberately lets you choose a starter so that you can defend yourself against wild Pokemon, but your encounter with him is still unplanned and the whole arrangement is again pretty spontaneous. While Rowan was the main professor in modern day Sinnoh, at the time his ancestors' Galaxy team was first braving the region, the professor in charge of studying Pokemon was Professor Laventon. His design is perhaps a bit more intricate than your average professor, which may be due in part to the fact that he lived in the past when clothing options were a bit different. I'm referring to his striated pants, old-timey boots, and patterned cold hat. There's also the fact that he sports the Galaxy team logo on his lab coat to signify that he's a member of their survey corps. Laventon wears an undervest, just like I pointed out with Rowan, which makes me realize that the choice to feature such a clothing item is probably because both professors work in one of the colder regions of the Pokemon world, so they require proper layering. Laventon's outfit features the color purple as an accent, which is fitting considering the kind of flower that he's named after. But aside from giving off a feeling of old-timiness, Laventon's posh look also hints at his origins. Although he moved to Sinnoh back when it was still called Hisui to help study its wildlife, Laventon is heavily implied to come from the Galar region, which is based on the British Isles. His antiquated western attire suddenly makes more sense when you have a European-inspired origin like Galar in mind for him. There's other clues that seem to back up this theory, like him making a reference to Copperajah saying it can be found in his home region. Copperajah was first discovered in Galar, and at the time Professor Laventon was introduced in Legends Arceus, the Pokemon could only be found there. There's also the fact that, at least in the English version of the game, Laventon talks like a sort of stereotypical fancy Englishman, and the smokestack on the Galaxy building where he works is fashioned to resemble Galarian wheezing. The Galaxy team is largely comprised of people who came from other regions, so Laventon isn't special in that regard, but I think there's a reason why the Galaxy team character that you interact with the most is from Galar specifically. I think it's meant to tie Legends Arceus to the new region that was introduced in the same generation, to draw a connection between it and Sword and Shield. In the past, Pokemon remakes would often make small references to the main regions in their respective generations, creating a sort of familiarity between the brand new games and the remakes that were released around the same time. It's marketing synergy, but it could also make players who started in that gen feel more at home if they recognize something from a game they already played. Laventon's goal is to compile Hisui's first Pokédex, and he enlists your help to accomplish this. But unlike with other games, working on your Pokédex is at the forefront of Legends Arceus, and your story progression is directly tied to the amount of Pokémon you catch in battle. Laventon's Pokédex is but a mere scrapbook instead of a modern electronic device, and in addition to simply obtaining Pokémon, the Dex urges you to complete research tasks like catching multiples of the same species or observing their moves in battle. This is because, unlike in the modern day, some of these Pokémon are actually only being documented for the first time now, and there's not much pre-existing info on them. Laventon is a sort of historical pioneer of Pokemon catching and Pokédex filling, even though he has others do it for him. In spite of this, his dialogue seems to imply that he did not necessarily come up with the general concept of a Pokédex, and that the origins of the idea might be even older still, but he did facilitate the compiling of the first Hisui/Sinnoh Pokédex, so he deserves some recognition for that at the very least. It's worth mentioning that because the Pokédex in Legends Arceus was made so that you could complete it without trading, in the post-game, Laventon actually straight up gives you the 2 starters that you didn't pick at first. It's the first time a professor gives the player a complete starter trio on the same save file, but it makes sense because technically you're the one who initially caught all 3, but he only let you keep 1. You can also get all 3 Kanto starters in Yellow and Let's Go, but they're not given to you by the professor. Moving on to Unova, the professor introduced in Generation 5 was Professor Juniper. At the time, she was notable for being the first main professor in the core games to be female, which would continue to be true for another 2 generations after her introduction. She has a bit of a business casual look with a short pencil skirt, prominent earrings, and a neatly tied bun of sorts, I think. Her hair looks both practical and elegant. Her lab coat also features a bigger flared up collar, which adds to her silhouette. I'm starting to notice that professors after Gen 3 often take a more formal and kempt approach to their styles, whereas the older professors looked a bit messier and less glamorous, almost like their jobs didn't allow enough time for excessive grooming. Professor Juniper is said to study the origin of Pokemon. I'm not really sure what that entails, but it's referring to how Pokemon life came to be on the planet, and I assume evolution in a Darwinian sense. Regardless, her specialty seems the least meaningful within the context of her games to me, because I can't really think of any obvious ways it connects to the themes of Unova. In both Black and White and their sequels, Juniper is not present when you pick your starter Pokemon. Whether she drops them off at your house or has Bianca deliver them to you, she seems to trust young trainers with handling the process. Perhaps this is because the Unova player characters were the first to be coded as older and therefore possibly more reliable. It could also hint at Juniper either being more busy than previous professors or simply more laid back and unconventional. In the Unova games, we also meet Professor Juniper's father, Cedric Juniper. His main role is to upgrade your Pokédex, and not a whole lot is known about him, but we know he's some kind of researcher just like his daughter. Despite his relatively inconsequential appearances, Cedric Juniper seems to just be a nice and helpful older gentleman with a fair bit of knowledge on Pokemon in the region. He's kinda wholesome actually, especially since he has a tendency to bring up his daughter, showing that the two keep in touch quite well and presumably also exchange scientific findings. I just thought I'd mention him. The two Junipers don't look too alike, but they both have these upward swooping hairstyles, I guess. Next up, as we make our way to the Kalos region, is Professor Sycamore, another fairly popular one I'd say, and I think that's in no small part due to his luscious locks and fashionable appearance. Just like with everything else in this French-inspired region, Sycamore's design emphasizes style and beauty. He's also based in the largest city in Kalos, which isn't really the case for most other professors who tend to have their labs in more secluded areas. With this in mind, it makes sense that his attire would reflect a more glamorous urban environment. Sycamore used to be friends with Lysander, who is the villain in Sycamore's debut games X and Y. I like the idea of the professor having a history with the main antagonist. It just kinda makes sense to me and it adds some intrigue to the narrative. They're sort of like counterparts, which is intentionally or not reflected in their designs, with Lysander having red as his main accent color and Sycamore wearing a blue shirt. It's warm versus cold, but it also kinda looks like the colors of X and Y. Call me a pro shipper, but I think these two are interesting together. Anyhow, Sycamore is an expert on evolution, with his latest focus being Mega Evolution, the first battle gimmick in Pokemon added in X and Y. Future Professor's research is also typically related to their region's new gimmicks in some way, a trend started by Sycamore. Interestingly enough, Sycamore actually studied under Professor Rowan from Sinnoh in his youth, hence their similar fields of research into Pokemon evolution. I feel like if BDSP weren't faithful remakes, we could have seen Sycamore somewhere in Sandgem Town where Rowan's lab is, or at least have some other character mention him. When it comes to handing out starters, it seems Professor Sycamore takes a page from Juniper's book and has them delivered Trevor to the player, the opposite character rival, and Shauna by Tierno and Trevor. What's also notable is that Sycamore later allows you to pick from a second set of starters when you meet him in person, this time the Kanto trio, along with giving you a Mega Stone corresponding to the starter you pick. There were other instances in the franchise where you could pick from a different region starter selection, but this was the first time choosing a second starter was a mandatory event in the main story and not just an optional feature in the post-game. Again, I'm not counting Yellow or Let's Go because you can have all three, there is no choice element to it. Professors Sycamore and Juniper both received first names in English for unknown reasons. Maybe whoever was in charge of naming characters for the English version didn't like that Oak was the only professor with a full name, so they gave these two first names. But why them and none of the other professors? Perhaps with Juniper it's to distinguish her from her father, but then why do it for Sycamore? As of recording this video, I don't know where Professor Sycamore is in Pokemon Legends ZA, but it seems his position at the Pokémon Lab in Lumiose is being filled by Mabel, at least temporarily. Pre-release material doesn't refer to her as a professor, but it seems her role in Legends ZA might be similar, considering she's filling in for Sycamore and that she's even wearing his lab coat, or maybe just a lab coat. Regardless, I think reusing her character from X and Y and turning her from a villain into an ally is quite a great idea. I just love seeing characters in Pokemon after a time skip. We're not often treated to this in the games other than in Johto, Black 2 and White 2, and some small instances here and there. Mabel was a pretty minor side character in X and Y, and I think it's fun to give her a more important role now, kinda like with Caitlyn and Unova or Ingo in Hisui. It rewards the players who bother to remember the smaller characters. I also think her name retroactively fits a professor adjacent role. Most of them are named after trees in English, and while Mabel wasn't created to be a professor initially, her English name sounds a lot like Maple, which is a tree. Quite fortuitous. Mabel no longer wears her old Team Flare uniform and instead dons a stylish, semi-formal dress that uniquely seems to have long sleeves, along with tights, weird but cool fantasy shoes, and the aforementioned lab coat. Her signature blue color is still present in her slightly differently styled hair and tie, which seems to be the only part of her old uniform she decided to keep. And while she is no longer wearing her Flare Scientist visor, her new safety goggles suggest a similar sort of shape language. Great design. As a side note, I've seen some discussion pointing out that some people act like they're Mabel fans now but didn't care about her when X and Y came out. Well, I posted my Pokemon Villains video mere days before she was revealed to be in Legends ZA, and I praised the Flare Scientists in it, which now serves as proof that I always liked them and that I'm not just jumping on a bandwagon. I do wonder what happened between X and Y and Legends ZA that led to Mabel working with Sycamore. Maybe Zerosic or Malva ratted her out to the Interpol, but Sycamore stepped in and was like, "Will you let her off the hook if she promises to assist me in my research?" Maybe he took pity on her because she used to work for Lysander, who is Sycamore's old friend. I mentioned before that Samson Oak lives in Alola but is not the region's main professor. That position belongs to one of the most unique professors in Pokemon and probably my personal favorite, Professor Kukui. Kukui's vibe is completely different from all other professors. He's charismatic and relaxed and doesn't have that air of authority that other professors do, while still very much coming off as someone you can put your trust in. Remember how I said newer professors tend to look more proper? Well, Kukui is the exception because he's wearing a cap, sunglasses, short pants, and a pair of clogs, along with not wearing a shirt at all under his lab coat and exposing his chest. That's actually his most defining feature, as other characters pointed out, and he even stays shirtless in colder areas like Mount Lanakila. His cap has a rainbow on it which fits with Alola thematically, but the fact that he's wearing it also serves as an indicator of his skill in battle. In Pokemon, caps are typically associated with trainerdom as they're traditionally worn by player characters or other strong Pokemon trainers. On top of being a professor, Kukui is also a very capable battler. He was mentored by Kahuna Hala in his youth along with Team Skull's leader Guzma, and there's that professor and villain connection I was talking about earlier. Kukui even battles you as the final boss in Sun and Moon, filling the role of a champion in a region where a champion does not exist. In fact, Kukui's whole goal is to establish a traditional Pokemon League in Alola that can coexist with the local island challenge. Kukui's specialty is studying Pokemon moves, which is not only appropriate for the battling professor, but it also plays into Z moves, which were Alola's new battle gimmick in Gen 7. Bizarrely, some compare Kukui to the Masked Royale, a wrestler from Alola who participates in Battle Royales, a unique battle format in the region. People say they look alike, but personally I don't see it. In Sun and Moon, Kukui was the first professor to not be the one gifting you with a starter. Instead, it's Hala's job as per island tradition. In Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, Kukui does hand you your starter, but it's still a gift from Hala. It seems after X and Y, the new professors introduced were no longer the ones responsible for starter distribution, with the exception of Laventon. And I don't mean that they're not physically present when you get your starter like with Juniper and Sycamore. In Alola, Galar, and Paldea, starters straight up come from different characters entirely. At this point in the franchise, the expectations we have from professors are starting to be subverted and their roles are beginning to change somewhat. If you've paid close attention to Kukui Kukui's design, you'll have noticed a ring on his finger, and that's because this man is married to another professor. This is Professor Burnet, but she didn't always look like this. While her most relevant outing was in the Alola games as Kukui's wife, her first appearance was actually in Gen 5 in a 3DS app called the Pokemon Dream Radar. I've never played it myself, but it was used to obtain various items in Pokemon in Black 2 and White 2. Burnet studied a space called the Interdream Zone, so her expertise in other dimensions became helpful in Alola considering the region's ultra wormhole problem. Her look in Alola is a lighter, more stripped down version of her Gen 5 design, ditching the coat, only half wearing the bodysuit, and removing the goggles from her headpiece, among other small changes. Most obviously, Alola's son seems to have given her a hell of a tan. Either that or these are just different universe versions of the same character, kinda like with Archie. Burnet seems to have a bit of a crush on the Mask Royale, which is kinda messed up. I mean, how would Kukui feel if he knew? I like Burnet's inclusion in Alola. Like I said, I think it's awesome when obscure characters from Pokemon are reintroduced, and she's technically not even from a mainline game. I also find Burnet and Kukui extremely wholesome as a couple, especially in the anime. The Galar region introduced us to the elderly Professor Magnolia, who specializes in studying the Dynamax phenomenon. Like I hinted at before, she doesn't give out starters in Sword and Shield. Instead, you receive them from Galar's champion, Leon. Magnolia is dressed almost like a stereotypical grandma type, with the glasses, chain, haircut, and cane. I remember people thinking the bird on her staff was Corviknight's pre-evolution, because she was revealed before we knew about Corvisquire. In hindsight, it's probably just Corviknight itself. If you're wondering, Magnolia doesn't actually break the English tree-based name convention for professors. Although the word Magnolia typically makes you think of the flower, they can grow on trees called magnolia trees. Magnolia has been a professor for a long time, perhaps even longer than Rowan. By the time you meet her in Sword and Shield, she's close to retiring, and her presence in the game is perhaps more sparse than previous professors. Her involvement in the story and with your journey is limited. However, her granddaughter and assistant Sonia is very much present and involved with the plot, similarly to what we've come to expect from professors actually. And sure enough, when Magnolia retires, she passes on her lab coat and the title of Pokemon Professor to Sonia. Professor Sonia's findings on the history of the Galar region became wildly successful, with her published book even being present in the Academy Library in Scarlet and Violet one whole generation later in a completely different region. You could argue her focus on stuff like history and archaeology conflicts with the idea of being a Pokemon professor, but in this world, human history tends to be so closely tied to Pokemon that I think it works. Most mythology and historical events in Pokemon have something to do with one legendary or other, it's not much of a stretch. Sonia's design is very cute. Her top, boots, and even nails and eyes match, making teal her signature color. Not sure how she found clothes and nail polish that perfectly match her eyes, but good on her. She's got these little hearts in her hair too, which reappear in other parts of her design, adding to the cutesy bubbly aesthetic. I also like her wrist mounted device. It's kinda clunky, which creates some contrast with the rest of her outfit. It looks like after putting on her grandmother's lab coat, her iconic trench coat somehow ended up in Kalos with Emma. I kid of course, but it's kinda funny that they both wear something so similar. Maybe both coats are from the same brand, who knows? Paldea's main professors are both Sada and Turo based on which game you play. I won't go into detail about their characters because I discussed them in my villain video. Since I examined them as villains there, I would like to have a look at them as professors here, but that's the thing. They don't really function as professors in Scarlet and Violet. First of all, they're dead before the story even starts and you only talk to their AI copy, but even then you don't meet them in person until the end of the game. They have nothing to do with the Pokédex and they're not really present as a guide or ally throughout the story other than nudging you to unlock your covered legendary's power. And of course, Director Clavel is the one giving you your starter. I think that's fine, and in my opinion, they work as villains quite well for the most part, but other than the fact that their research relates to the Terastal phenomenon, which is Paldea's battle gimmick, they don't really exhibit any of the traits that professors typically do in Pokemon. Their English names don't even reference trees or any plants for that matter. In fact, they're named after the past and future in every language, but I digress. I will say, it was cool getting version-exclusive professors for the first time, but if anything, I'd say Jacques fits the Pokemon professor archetype more than Sada and Turo. Think about it for a second. He evaluates your Pokédex, is a biologist, and he's there to support you from the beginning as your homeroom teacher. He even looks the part of a professor with the lab coat and everything. He may not have the title, but for all intents and purposes, Jacques is Paldea's Pokemon professor in both Scarlet and Violet, and in our hearts. I know I didn't talk about every researcher or scientist in Pokemon, but the only additional characters that I really wanted to bring up were those that either have some kind of connection to the main professors and or a level of relevance in the games they appear in. I don't have many thoughts on say Fennel or Professor Cosmo, who doesn't even have a fixed unique design and is more of a meteorologist than a Pokemon professor. And then other scientist characters like Blaine and Mr. Fuji, who are implied to have worked on the creation of Mewtwo, feel too far removed from the professor archetype. But hey, if you really want to hear more about Pokemon scientists, I talk about some of the antagonistic ones in my villains video. If you enjoyed this video or enjoyed me, then I'd appreciate if you considered subscribing and or checking out my other stuff. I recommend the other installments in the A Look At series, which I neatly compiled into a playlist just for you. Your support means quite a lot to me, and the fact that y'all are interested in listening to me yap about Pokemon means I can pursue my true dream, so thanks sincerely to everyone who subscribed and commented on my vids. But with that aside, thank you for your time.